Welcome to my spoiler-filled review of Shazam, or who I like to call the original Captain Marvel. I sort of like this kind of video because I can kind of ramble a little bit more in here as opposed to my spoiler-free video. So this is going to be a little bit less organized than maybe some of the other content that I produce outside of these spoiler-filled videos. So anyways, I just want to mention one disclaimer. I'm going to continually call this character, Shazam, Captain Marvel, because that is the identity that this character had for decades. In fact, he is the original Captain Marvel, and no lawsuit will ever change that. That is history. That is verified fact. For decades, there was Captain Marvel, and then other characters that were spin-offs, like Captain Marvel Jr., Mary Marvel, Uncle Marvel, and even the Marvel family. And this is before Marvel Comics even existed, even as Timely Comics. And there's even a character called Hoppy the Marvel Bunny, for example. Captain Marvel was created in 1939, and he first appeared in Whiz Comics #2 in February of 1940. And later, he had his own Captain Marvel comic book. So this is the kind of stuff that I think gets lost in time, but I don't believe we should overlook this just because of contract track disputes and things that have happened decades ago between Marvel and DC and that continue now due to legality and stuff like that, or legalese or that kind of stuff. It just sort of ruins the experience that a lot of us grew up with. Now we have to call established characters something else because of a lawsuit. I just think that's dumb, particularly when the original Captain Marvel was first by decades. So anyways, The Adventures of Captain Marvel was the first superhero film as well. It was more like a series, or I think they called it a serial, with like 12 different episodes that appeared in certain movie theaters. And that was in 1941, for example. So that's just an example of how far back the Captain Marvel identity goes. And I think that just because the movie doesn't ever reference Captain Marvel, that should not be something that changes our behavior per se. So anyways, Shazam also doesn't seem like a good name for a character, since the character can't ever say Shazam without changing, from Billy Batson to Shazam and back and forth. So anyways, I don't think they thought this out well enough, and I think they should have at least mentioned the name Captain Marvel. Like in this movie, they didn't mention Captain Marvel once. I would have liked to have heard that mentioned, and I didn't like that they completely avoided it. One of the things to think about is back in the day, in the comics, they could actually mention and call him Captain Marvel. They just couldn't put it as the title of a comic book. They had to just sort of embed it in there and sort of downplay that. So in this film, they would call him Captain Sparklefingers or Captain Sparkles or whatever. They'd call him different things as sort of a joke. And I think that really got old the second and third time they tried to use that. And I think that to some extent, they're making fun of that absurd legal drama around the Captain Marvel name, but it really would have been nice if they actually settled on that name or any name for his character by the end of the film. And I think it was a weakness that they didn't do that. And I think they could have at least used Captain Marvel and then made a joke about, well, someone else is using that name or whatever, but they didn't go that route, and they never even used that name. So that kind of disappointed me. So I remarked in my non-spoiler video that the characters were different between Billy Batson and Captain Marvel, at least historically. And they sort of made, in this movie, Billy Batson and Captain Marvel the same character. He retained all the identity and memories and stuff like that. But his personality did change a little bit. And that's something that I didn't comment in that video, and I wanted to explore more here. Billy Batson was more dark in this film and lacked the optimism that his character has been known for decades, for nearly a century at this point, almost 80 years, something like that. The portrayal of Captain Marvel has historically been that of the eternal good guy. Even more childlike innocence, that's a throwback to the silver and even golden age of comic books. DC Comics has tried to go for a more gritty and realistic type of character since their Crisis on Infinite Earths back in 1986. And more recently, since then, they made him darker and grittier. And their recent comic book movies, from Christian Bale's Dark Knight series to this DCE Extended Universe, has been more dark and gritty. And I think that that's rubbed off too much on this Billy Batson character, who is more serious than even his superhero counterpart in the same film. Billy, I think, was too jaded, but Captain Marvel was conversely too childish, and I think that kind of maybe should have been switched in this film. But regardless, those two personalities didn't match, even though they were the same person in the same film. It's like he changed his personality a little bit when he became the superhero. And I think that the hope and innocence and the idealism that Captain Marvel has traditionally represented was kind of gone here. And in this movie, he's gifted the adoration of the public without ever really earning it, at least not towards the end of the film, the third act. But in the middle, he's a bit of a, I won't say it here, but bit of a flawed character, I'll just say that. And I just think that he was too flawed, and I think that just sort of took away from that. At least I would have liked to have seen a more heroic version of him throughout. And keep in mind, I don't want all these characters in all these movies to be identical, but Captain Marvel is the one character who can be the actual bright-eyed and innocent superhero that stands out amongst this darker and grittier time. And I know I keep repeating dark and gritty, but that's the way that this new set of films for the last couple of decades have been portrayed. They learned that if you go ultra campy, like Batman and Robin, and other Batman films in the 90s, that you can cause a harsh reaction by the audience. But I think we've seen more recently with Man of Steel and Justice League to some extent that you can go too dark as well. And I would like them to aim a little bit more towards a happy medium, and then have, their offshoots that can be like really dark and then really bright. And Captain Marvel, I think, is that character that could be represented in such a bright way. So I realize this is sort of a tangent, and it's launching off in a spoiler-filled review. So let me sort of go more into what relates to the movie itself. But related to the character, Captain Marvel, he retains, all of these attributes, from Greek and Roman gods. Like Mercury is a Roman god, but Hercules is, well, he's more of a half god, son of Zeus, half human character. But Zeus is a Greek god, for example. So Captain Marvel has all these, powers coming from these characters. But two attributes I didn't really see here, is, the courage of Achilles. That's one of the things here. He was never really courageous throughout the film, except towards the end. And it was because he had this superpower that he was courageous, not because of an intrinsic ability, or something that was, cast upon him by this magic. It was just, hey, now I'm powerful, therefore I'm courageous, or now I'm overcoming something, rather than this is an attribute of this magic that imbues him, or it's an inner part of him that has this courage and bravery and stuff like that. Also, the wisdom of Solomon, that could have been an aspect I thought would have been really good in this film, where he could have maybe had, I've got this information from somewhere, that I would not normally know, but that's because of this wisdom of Solomon. Or here's this wise advice I'm imparting that comes from either within or from this magic that has empowered me. And I didn't quite see that there. It was mostly the cheap physical, hey, I'm bulletproof, or hey, I can fly kind of stuff. Or hey, I'm super fast, or shoot electricity. Those other four attributes that there was a focus on. And I would like to see in future films this wisdom and courage and bravery and indomitable will come through that we don't see in this film. So I'll digress from this sort of, diatribe or monologue in the beginning here. And I'll just say that I do like how the superhero character is largely the same as, between the boy character and the adult character, how it's essentially the same person. I would like to see more nobility and the desire to be good in both characters. That's because it's more representative. If you ever see some of the depictions of Captain Marvel in the comics, particularly in the last few decades, it's aspirational. Look at the artwork by Alex Ross, both from Kingdom Come and from later, that there's sort of, this kid used to be really good. Like in Kingdom Come, he was really good, but he was dark in this here, but there was sort of a a reminiscence of he used to be good and now he's really dark here because he's brainwashed. And then in these other series later on where he's this hopeful, graceful, iconic character that maybe Superman can look up to and idolize. Man, there's some aspects to you that I no longer represent. Anyways, I'll digress there. But let me just give you a couple examples of what I'm talking about. The introduction of Billy Batson has him locking up some cops in the very beginning of the film, and then he steals, the lunch from one of them, and then he obtains the address of some woman, through the computer system in the car. I thought that was somewhat particularly evil and not representative of this character. Also, Captain Marvel, when he's a superhero, Shazam, and Freddy, they steal money from an ATM machine, for example. I thought that was not particularly good. Also, there's that scene in the park where he basically hears this woman scream because there's a smugger, and he accidentally, knocks this villain into the trash bags down the way, and the woman's like, "Here, take all my money." It's like $73, and then they're just taking this money and the money they get from the ATM machine they're using, and they buy a bunch of stuff to play video games and stuff. And I just thought that this guy's more of a criminal, a petty criminal, and even later he's pandering, to some people. Hey, I'm shooting lightning out of my hands, and he's pandering to these people for money. And I just thought these are not the characteristics of a superhero, and he's a far digression or regression from the idealism that I would like to see in this kind of character. So anyways, just want to point out this is not a critique of any of the actors, but it's one of those aspects of this film that I thought that they didn't nail right. The character of Billy Batson and Captain Marvel, that while they do a lot of good things with, and that he's a child and he's experiencing the different sides of being a child without superpowers to being essentially an overpowered superhero. And I think those two things are important and very good in this film. But Captain Marvel is supposed to be such an ideal, hopeful, optimistic type of character that he should be able to pick up Thor's hammer easily because he's of that sterling type of character. And that's not the kid in this film. This Billy Batson and Captain Marvel would never be able to pick up Thor's hammer no matter how strong he is. And as I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, the movie dragged a bit in a few places, but I thought some of the elements of the film were good, but there were definitely some parts that got old quick. Like it took forever for them to test all the attributes of his powers. And then they made a bunch of YouTube videos, and this sort of stick sort of carried on too long. And, I'm not really sure what I would have cut from this film, but I think there are little bits here and there they could have just kind of trimmed out a little bit, especially some of the gory moments. Like there's that one scene where basically this guy got beheaded, this executive in this, business suite up in the in a tall part up in this high rise of the skyscraper, and he gets beheaded and his body thrown out. I thought that was a bit too much. I would have cut that from the scene. Any of those gory parts I would have cut as well. I think they could have lent to as much of the horror and dark aspects of how bad and evil these people are without showing that kind of gore on film. I do wonder if I had too high expectations going into this film before seeing this movie. There was a little bit of hype coming out, on social media and other places that I was aware of, and I think that sort of made me build up too much what I was expecting from this film. So when I walked in and saw it, I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I thought I might. But I still agree with my oldest son that this is a better movie than Captain Marvel from last month with Brie Larson. And this is overall a better film in many ways. Not just the storyline, but the actual characters themselves are more humanizing, a wider range of emotions. And I'd much rather hang out with this Captain Marvel than the one in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I'm just being honest here. I thought he would be a much cooler person to hang out with in either form. I will say this, the trailers didn't spoil anything. That's something I was a little worried about. That's something we've seen a lot in the last few years, that the studios basically farm out to a third party to make an appetizing trailer, and they end up just littering it with a lot of details. The entire third act is largely devoid from the trailers, except for like a brief glimpse, but the major spoiler that took place in the third act regarding essentially the Marvel family, that is not revealed in any trailers, and you don't see it anywhere. And I thought the studio did a really good job, and the press and everyone else did a good job at holding this information out from the public. So, and one of the interesting thing about all the different Captain Marvel family characters is each of them seem to have all the superpowers that Captain Marvel does, but they sort of specialize in one attribute of the other. And there's 6 of them, but each of the other 5 other Captain Marvel family members, specializing in speed or the power of Zeus or strength or whatever. And I thought that was an interesting aspect here. And actually, if you think about it, there's the one part where Thaddeus, he basically has, 6 of the 7 attributes out there, or fighting, the other characters, leaving just envy inside of him. And I thought that was kind of cool that, maybe Thaddeus is somewhat underpowered, but Captain Marvel is maybe somewhat underpowered because some of his power is shared with the rest of his family. So anyways, that's kind of an interesting dynamic. They didn't really spell out in the film, but I think that's a possibility. But regardless, I thought the final battle and the action scenes were pretty good there. But I literally didn't expect the whole Marvel family to be in this one. And they sure enough was, and I think that actually helped to add and flesh out to the development of the 3rd act in this story here. This is not a typical origin story. I like that it largely went in chronological order. They introduced the villain up front first in the opening scene when he was younger, and they gave him a reason for being who he was. I thought that was pretty good. Dr. Savannah, Thaddeus Savannah. I thought he was a really good villain throughout, and that while he's relatively monotone in terms of who he is as an adult, he has a definite backstory and a reason for being what he is, even though it's a little bit of a, like, him as a young man and him as an adult are completely 2 different characters, but you can kind of see why he grew up to be the way he was. And I thought he was a good villain in this case, and some of his lines I thought were delivered really well and happened to spell out who he was and why he did what he was without it being too campy or too corny. If you think of the original Superman movie with Lex Luthor basically doing a complicated real estate scheme, this was a lot better. Him essentially trying to seek out the champion and steal his powers and become this all-powerful kind of individual, to live up to a fantasy that he was never good enough. I thought that was a good enough background for this kind of character. But I want to go back to one thing that I mentioned earlier, and that's that one scene where one of the monsters beheads one of the business executives. But basically the entire room is murdered just off screen. And I thought that was a little bit too much in this PG-13 movie, given that millions of kids are going to see this movie. I thought that was a little too much on the nose, and I've got some more stuff on that as well. But you don't have to make your point of how evil and bad these people are in this type of film and showing this sort of grisly, gruesome murders happening on screen. So that's one of the issues that I took out of this film. And I'll point out that since I was talking about the third act, these monsters come out and they attack all these people, and they could have easily murdered a whole bunch of them. So they're unusually restrained in this 3rd act, considering they had no compunction of just murdering an entire room of people. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect. It's like, oh, these are going to hunt down these kids. Well, they're going to kill them immediately. And they don't. And they don't really spell out that they're trying to hold them to use as a ransom. It seems like Thaddeus basically tells them, hunt them down, is what it seems like. Yet what they do is they get captured. And I just thought there was a sort of disconnect there. And that they could have easily murdered a bunch of people in the carnival and nothing happened and no further death happened. And so some of the, I don't know, I just thought it was weird that they would, in the middle, in the 2nd act, make them really gruesome, mass murdering people, monsters basically. But in the 3rd act, they basically were just booga booga type monsters, and they just attacked these kids and then held them. And then I don't know, they just lost their fear appeal. So also one of the things I wanted to mention, that there were a few continuity errors here. One in particular bothered me was when Thaddeus met the wizard again as an adult, and he basically looked like he killed them. And then a scene or two later, Billy Batson is on the train and then gets taken to that same, out of continuity location, and there's the same wizard there, not dead, and basically giving him his powers. And I just thought that was kind of a weird, how does this A scene happen here, and then later on this B scene happen, when what happened in A would have prevented B from happening, and what happens in B doesn't seem to portend or spell out any of the consequences of what happened in the first scene. So I don't know. Maybe it was one of those things that when I see the movie again, it'll make more sense, but as it was, I just thought that was a continuity error. That was like really the one that stood out. I think there were a couple others, but can't think of them offhand, and I'm not going to try to recall that in the middle of this review. One of the things I liked was the Taki Tani shout out in the carnival with the tiger doll. For some of you that don't know, Taki Tani was a humanized tiger, a tiger that wanted to be human in the Captain Marvel comics, basically. And I like that they at least had a sort of indirect shout out to him there. One of the problematic aspects of this film, I thought, was the whole mass hysteria set up in the very beginning, when this woman doctor is apparently video conferencing interviews with people, one in particular, and then she's basically just talking down to this person about it being mass hysteria, and it didn't seem to me like maybe she believed that, and I thought it was a little bit unbelievable, her interactions with Dr. Savannah after they got off the video call, basically. And then there's the aspect of Dr. Savannah just painting symbols on some sort of door, and then the woman slapped the door and then she disintegrated on screen. I just thought that was kind of weird, and his sort of emotionless reaction to it sort of took away some of the, oh my God, this is happening right now kind of thing. And it's like it didn't even happen while he was watching it. So that was a weird disconnect there. And she was just killed very trivially, like some of the other characters throughout the film. I just thought that was hard to watch. And I found, of course, those other graphic deaths throughout the films just didn't match up with a film that's essentially aimed for kids and young adults. I also found it hard to believe that Thaddeus Savannah was bullied at all by his older brother at this point in reality. Like in the beginning when he's a kid, I could see him being bullied. But when he walked into that room again as like with all these powers within him, to me that seemed like he was before he was filled with all these powers. So when he walks in this room, there's that, I don't think his bigger brother was a threat to him at all at this point in his life. It would have been more interesting if Thaddeus would have been this sort of thin, frail, maybe bespectacled character earlier before he was empowered by these people. Maybe that would have been a better portrayal. But as it was, his non-powered form versus powered form was basically identical, and that sort of took away that potential aspect of an interesting aspect of his character. Like Captain Marvel is interesting because Billy Batson becomes Captain Marvel, and there's this dichotomy of being an underpowered individual with an overpowered individual. Dr. Savannah could have also had that aspect where he's underpowered and then he's powered up, and then he stands up tall and has this more ability, and that could have been a more interesting dynamic, but that was avoided here for some reasons. So also there were some unbelievable scenes with regard to like those two bullies that kept running into Freddy over time. In one particular, they literally run into him with their truck, and they park it sideways in front of the school and just park it and walk in. Like, no one does that. That defies reality. That was one of those on-the-nose moments where it's like, hey, we're going to make fun of the whole bullies in school, trope, but we're going to overdo it in this film. And another on-the-nose feature is, here's this, scene where he becomes a father, where the two boys are in school and they try to get past the security guard, and Billy goes off screen, says Shazam, and then comes back as an adult trying to get his kid. That was funny, but they overdid that, calling him a moron when his name's Moran, and the security guard is a dumb parody of the security guard. So that was another one of those on-the-nose moments. The debate between Billy in his superhuman form, and Freddy, when out in the second act, when they're out in front of a bunch of people, that was in the lightnings in the hand, scene. That debate I thought was a little bit too on the nose, and you don't have that debate in front of dozens of people, because that could sort of lead to revealing this person's superhero identity as another kid, or the relationship between these two. The whole reason you protect the innocence as a superhero by having a secret identity is you don't expose them later. Yet all throughout this film, Freddy is being exposed as being a friend of Captain Marvel, and that becomes, the tie-in to why Dr. Savannah is able to find, Freddy and his family in the first place. So I thought that was too much on the nose. That scene where Billy meets his real mom, and then everyone in the building, as he's walking through in the very, very first part of being in that building, is some guy yelling at a woman. He walks by this room and you can hear a guy yelling at a woman. Later on, he's walking by, I think there's another one. Then he knocks on the door, and there's his mom, and there's this guy on the other end of the door yelling at her. And I thought that was a bit overdone. The shithole comment I thought was a bit too much. Just as in Captain Marvel a month ago, here we are with the exact same shithole joke, and it's going to be a little bit distressing if we're going to hear that in every superhero movie. This shithole comment. Enough is enough. We don't need to hear the same thing. Well, the same thing with Captain Sparklefingers. You can make fun of his name once or twice in the film, but you can do it 3 or 4 times. It gets to be a bit too much. Also, another thing I thought was interesting in this film was, when Freddy was way back in the distance and he threw this batarang and it hit Thaddeus, and then he turns around and you see blood coming out of it. There's no way those kids could have seen that way back there, but here, even Freddy can tell that Thaddeus bled when he hit him with the batarang. So, I don't know, I thought that was kind of weird. I'm not sure how he would have figured that out. So, there was a lot of issues and things that concerned me in this film. I want to point out that even though I'm mentioning a bunch of negative things in this film, these are basically the only things that I thought were bad in this film. The good things I thought in this film were basically the overall characters in the film. I thought they were really humanizing, even though they were portrayed differently than the way that I would have liked to have seen them. I thought that the story in itself was a contiguous story that from beginning to end was relatively consistent. It didn't feel like it was put together by too many different people. It didn't feel like they spent tons of hours filming a variety of different lines and then put it together in post. It seemed like that this had an overall design from beginning to end that was largely chronological, despite an apparent continuity error, or maybe 2. But I think that overall, if you go into this movie and you don't have too high expectations, I think you'll enjoy this film. I think if you go into this film and have too low expectations, it'll come out really good. I think this is one of the better films in the DC Extended Universe. There's been 7 of them so far, and this is at least tied for 3rd with the Suicide Squad movie, in my opinion. And it's under Wonder Woman and Aquaman, and I'll make a separate quick little video on that. But overall, I think this was a good film. I think it really added to the depth of this DC Extended Universe. I think that it basically provided for other types of films of this genre to come out and not be dull, dark, painful, gritty movies. I would like to see more of these movies come out that, if they're aimed for kids, not have a contradictory, gruesome, horrifying aspect that is too dark for kids. Or if they go for this mid-range young adult kind of movie, that'll still appeal to kids, even if they don't get all the jokes, but still appeal to older people like myself. I don't want them necessarily to talk down to anyone when they make these films. And I think that's actually one of the areas where this Shazam film does better than the original than the recent Captain Marvel movie from a month ago, because there's no political overtones throughout. It doesn't talk down to anyone in particular. It just has some slight issues in presentation that, all in all, don't destroy the film the way Captain Marvel was destroyed for a lot of people that went in to see the film and were disappointed. And I happen to have liked that film. But this one I liked a lot more. And that's going to go ahead and do it for my spoiler-filled review of this. Basically, I think it's a good movie, and I think most people will enjoy it. And I hope that it actually outperforms the more recent Captain Marvel movie. And I hope it leads the way in this DC Extended Universe to make better DC films, because I think for too long, for the last decade, they've been too far behind the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.